Case Western Reserve is a high-impact research university that aspires to be a community where humanity, science, and technology meet to create a just and thriving world. So let me let those final words sink in just one more time. A community that strives to create a just and thriving world. Now, with all of the events that have taken place last week, all of the chatter that's happening in and around the inauguration and expected continuances of the activity that we saw last week, the unfortunate and activity that we saw in our nation last week, I think that these words and ideals that are part of who we are, that is part of our North Star, these are alive and palpable and far more important now, given the times that we're in. And that's really why we need conversations like these, ones where we need to keep the civil discourse and learning alive at our institution. Today's talk is going to feature a robust conversation on the state of higher education and specifically the role of interdisciplinarity in benefiting society. And at the end of today's program, Dean Joy Ward and I will engage all of you in a question and answer session with our presenter. I am delighted to be kicking off this first of our series with the College of Arts and Sciences and with Dean Ward, who, of course, has recently come to us and has started to make an immediate impact, a positive impact on our institution. With all of this in mind, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. Paul is Vice Chancellor and Professor of the Humanities and Social Sciences at the United States International University in Africa. For those of you unfamiliar with the Vice Chancellorship at USIU, it is the equivalent of the presidency. Professor Zeleza, President Zeleza, Vice Chancellor Zeleza, is also a dear friend who I've had the pleasure of getting to know as I've served on the board of USIU Africa over the past year. Paul's vita is illustrious. With time spent at 12 universities in 6 countries on 3 continents and within the Caribbean, he has held distinguished academic and administrative positions for over the past 25 years. He is a leader in academic governance and policy analysis. He is an expert in African gender, diaspora, and development studies. He has been published more than 300 times and authored or edited 28 books, several of which have won international awards. He has presented nearly 250 keynote addresses and lectures at leading universities and conferences in 32 countries. He has served on the editorial boards of more than 24 journals and book series. He is currently the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Bibliographies Online in African Studies. I don't know how he does that, apart from teaching and running a university. In the early 2000s, he worked as a consultant for the Ford and MacArthur Foundations on their initiatives to revitalize higher education in Africa. And later, his work for the Carnegie Corporation of New York led to the establishment of the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship Program in 2013. And that has now sponsored nearly 400 African-born academics in the United States and in Canada to work with dozens of universities in 6 African countries. He has received numerous awards and honorary degrees from major universities for his scholarship, and in July 2013, he was recognized by the New York Times as one of 43 great immigrants in the United States. I am delighted to welcome today Dr. Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. Paul?
Good morning, everyone. Here it's in the afternoon. It's truly a pleasure for me to join you in this great seminar, the North Star Seminar. When I started talking to Provost Vinson and Dean Ward on this opportunity, I was really excited. I'd like to begin by wishing everyone a Happy New Year. We all, of course, hope 2021 will be better than 2020. I'll share just a brief outline of my presentation. I think here we are. All right. So what I will do is simply talk about four major areas. One is the changing landscapes of knowledge production since World War II, because I think it is important, and you'll understand as a historian, I like to look back in order for us to understand where we are now, and of course, to plan for the future. Secondly, I will specifically talk about the challenges and opportunities of interdisciplinarity. And then third, I'll share with you very briefly my own personal journey towards interdisciplinarity. And then the academic enterprise after COVID-19. And I'll conclude with very few remarks about my own current work. So let me begin by sharing with you, I'll stop sharing this outline and share with you the areas that I would like to talk about, beginning, of course, with the changes in the global academy since World War II. In a book that I wrote several years ago, in 2016 to be more precise, the book was on the transformation of global higher education, 1945 to 2015. In that book, I tried to discuss some of the key changes that have taken place in the academy, in higher education, on every continent, Asia, Europe, the Americas, and of course, Africa, over the last 70 years. The first chapter looks at the post-war boom, as it's called, the universalization of higher education. Chapter 2 looks at what is entitled Money Matters, Economic and Occupational Disruptions. The third chapter, which I'll be drawing some key outcomes, is Disciplining Knowledges, Ruptures in Academic Systems. And the fourth chapter, Global Village, The Competitive Challenges of Internationalization. And then finally, chapter 5, Quality Control, Struggles for Accountability and Value. In chapter 3, I specifically look at the systems and configurations of knowledge production, dissemination, and organization as determined by the demands and diversities of historical geography and the interplay of institutional, intellectual, and ideological dynamics. I identify four major changes. One is the shifts in the international division of intellectual labor between and within regions. And here one can see over the last 70 years, declining dominance of the Western countries and rising importance of Asia and other regions in the global South. And some of the key indicators include, of course, R&D expenditures and their sources, of course, sources being government, business, and investors, and there have been shifts in that configuration. And then regional distribution of researchers and publications. So just to give you a couple of data points, in 2013, R&D expenditures globally as a percentage of GDP was 1.7. For North America, it was 2.7%. For Europe, 1.8%. For Asia, 1.7%. And Latin America, 0.7%. And Africa, 0.5%. By 2014, Asia claimed the bulk of global scholarly publications. It had reached 39.5%, Europe 39.3%, North America 28.6%, Latin America and the Caribbean 5.2%, and Africa 2.6%. There's also been shifts, of course, in research focus, the relationship between basic, applied research, and in terms of priority areas. Again, that's an area that has been fascinating to watch. And then secondly, shifts in the disciplinary architecture of knowledge. First of all, the expansion of what I call the four cultures of the academy: humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, and professions. And the reconfiguration of all disciplines and emergence of new ones, development of complex interactions among the disciplines, and of course, struggles for academic capital, for hegemony and hierarchies in the academy. The Third area is the development of new theoretical, analytical, methodological, and educational trends, whose trajectories varied obviously among and within countries and institutions. So, for example, in the humanities, we see the rise of critical theory, cultural studies, and the post-colonialism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, expansion of temporal, spatial, and social scope, for example, history in the United States, encompassing the teaching of Europe, of course, not only Europe, but regions in the global south, including Africa. And of course, in terms of scope, gender history and other types of history becoming increasingly important. And of course, the diversification of research methods and data sources. In the social sciences, you find the social sciences grappling with institutionalization, internationalization, interdisciplinarity, theory, and of course, quantitative and qualitative research methods, hierarchies, and application of relevance in terms of social science knowledges, which became increasingly important in the post World War II state interested in planning. And in the natural sciences, of course, massive expansion in research, education, and support, and obviously the various revolutionary discoveries that we all know about. The emergence of vast new interdisciplinary fields, intensification of collaboration in terms of knowledge production, and the rise of international big science and academic industry partnerships. In the professions, you find that universities increasingly incorporated vocational fields from education to business, to law, to medicine. The third major change that I document in the book, in that particular chapter, is what I call the growth of the digital academy. Spectacular growth of technology, which transformed all aspects of higher education. There was the massive growth of technology-related degrees and emergence of new fields in the hard, biological, and medical sciences, facilitated by technological changes. Changes in the modalities of teaching and learning, face-to-face, blended, and online, which we all know have been accelerated by COVID-19. And then, of course, the transformation in the role of libraries, academic publishing, and scholarly communication and collaboration. Finally, we also know that these changes exposed disparities in access to digital resources and among and within nations, institutions, and disciplines, and of course, along the social inscriptions of gender, class, and age. This has become particularly evident following COVID-19, when institutions had to pivot to using online platforms for teaching and learning. Then secondly, let me talk very briefly about the challenges and opportunities of interdisciplinarity. The academy, as we all know, is typically divided into disciplinary and interdisciplinary fields. But the institutional and intellectual boundaries between the two are neither always clear nor uniform across universities or countries. In the introductory chapter to my book, The Study of Africa, Volume 1, Disciplinary and Interdisciplinary Encounters, I examine some key aspects of interdisciplinarity. So if you allow me, I'll take a few minutes looking at some of those aspects. One is, what are some of the common critiques of interdisciplinarity? Of course, there are many, but I've identified 4 for this particular presentation. One is that interdisciplinarity is seen as a threat to disciplinary boundaries, hierarchies, and rigor. Secondly, that its objectives and modalities are poorly defined and conceptualized, insofar as borrowing among disciplines is normal. Third, that its pedagogical benefits are doubtful for students lacking strong disciplinary foundations, that it offers them fragmentary exposure to bits and pieces of various disciplines and impedes their development of disciplinary competence. Finally, that interdisciplinary studies programs are typically shallow in substituting intellectual rigor for topical excitement, and the costs of these programs are too high. Of course, the advocates of interdisciplinarity present a different picture. They argue that interdisciplinarity is a creative space between disciplines where new questions are asked, new approaches developed, new understandings are advanced, and new fields and disciplines emerge. That Secondly, it connects disciplinary insights to address questions that transcend disciplinary boundaries and enhances the problem-solving capacities of scholarship. That thirdly, disciplines and interdisciplines are complementary and illuminate each other and promote among students higher order thinking and more intellectual maturity. Fourth, that more careers and employers require specialized backgrounds that are interdisciplinary. And finally, that there is nothing inherently wrong with addressing the relevant issues of the day that face society. Let me conclude this particular section by sharing with you what I call the historiography of interdisciplinarity, the various aspects of interdisciplinarity that I think all of us need to pay attention to. In my view, first of all, it reflects the complexity, chaos, messiness, and indivisibility of real life better than the compartmentalized disciplines do. And then that while advances in knowledge occur in the traditional disciplines, they're even more likely in the intersections, in the liminal spaces between the disciplines, in the interdisciplinary fields that often emerge out of disciplinary interpenetration and struggles to overcome gaps and silences in the disciplines. And I also think that disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity tend to display different predispositions, not necessarily that one is better than the other, but they are different. Disciplinarians are more prone to academic, sometimes ethnocentricity, while interdisciplinarians are more inclined to openness. Disciplines and interdisciplinarity have existed in dialectical tension, and the dynamics of their interaction have continuously changed since the emergence of the modern research university in the 19th century. In fact, what we call the disciplines today emerged out of meta-disciplines of previous centuries. Most of the disciplines and the interdisciplines are actually new. They acquired their distinctive institutional and intellectual identities in the course of the 20th century, a process that was driven as much by administrative as by academic imperatives to divide knowledge production and pedagogy into manageable units, each with its own epistemic cultures and communities, foundational projects and commitments, and mechanisms of authorizing new knowledges. Interdisciplines came to be distinguished, in my view, by their lack of departmentalization, to refer to intellectual activities between disciplines, to various forms of disciplinary transgressions, intersections, borrowings, and collaborations. Various metaphors have been used to capture the divide between disciplinary and interdisciplinary formation. In my work, I tend to distinguish between three types of metaphors that we tend to see people use. One is geographical metaphors about boundaries. I've actually been using that myself in this presentation. These geographical metaphors are particularly popular. Disciplines are seen as territories, fields, or turf that aspiring interdisciplinarians seek to cross, explore, or even annex and colonize. Then there is the metaphor of language, in which interdisciplinarity entails the learning the language of another discipline. It is akin to multilingualism and multiculturalism and requires acknowledgement of differences of values, epistemologies, ideologies, habits, teaching styles, meanings of scholarships, methods of argumentation, and notions of truth. In short, it is an act of translation and transculturation. Then there is the metaphor of marriage or courtship, in which interdisciplinarity is seen as a process of courtship between two distinct and often diverse disciplines that suddenly discover spheres of mutual interest and complementary resources. In this sense, interdisciplinarity emerges out of cooperative exchanges between disciplines that require alterations in the very questions and issues framing the interdisciplinary inquiry and interaction, which result in the production of new fields between and across disciplines. And in the book, I go into a lot of details to show how, in fact, this has happened. Whatever metaphor is used, disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity are mutually constitutive. The latter entails, indeed requires, the existence of the former. Metaphorical diversity underscores difficulties of conceptualizing and capturing the differences between the two in terms of their organization, objectives, and outcomes. In organizational terms, there is the institutional dimension, the administrative and bureaucratic location of academic units. An intellectual dimension, the epistemological foundations of academic fields in their conceptual, theoretical, and methodological orientations. And an ideological dimension, the political pressures and social imperatives of knowledge production. In terms of objectives, the teaching, research, public service, and innovation functions of the academy frame disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity in different ways. And so do the outcomes of knowledge production with regards to its audiences and patterns of knowledge dissemination and consumption. In many cases, what distinguishes the disciplines and interdisciplines is administrative conventions and convenience, rooted in historical precedents in which at any one moment, the two represent older and newer branches of knowledge that enjoy varying degrees of institutionalization. Many contemporary disciplines are unstable, porous entities which house increasingly fractious or distant subunits and specialities that overlap with those in other disciplines. And we have seen this certainly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Various social and cognitive motivations are involved in the pursuit of interdisciplinarity. Scholars cross disciplinary lines in response to the rise and fall of specialties and the perceived opportunities, both real and symbolic, of academic migration. There are also impulses of what some call disciplinary envy, the wish by disciplines or scholars within disciplines to model themselves on, borrow from, or appropriate the terms and vocabulary of more esteemed disciplines and their authorities in the perennial struggle for resources and reputational capital in the academy. We all know that the hierarchies in the academy, which of course many of us don't like, but they do exist. There is also, of course, the explosion of knowledge and the growing conviction by many scholars and sometimes by administrators interested in closing small departments that the 19th century intellectual division of knowledge is increasingly becoming obsolete. Each discipline is incapable by itself of explaining the complex and interconnected social, ecological, and physical phenomena and processes that characterize our increasingly globalized world. Let me conclude by looking at some of the types of interdisciplinary activities. Like disciplinarity, interdisciplinarity entails a series of different activities. It has varied programmatic, paradigmatic, and pedagogical dimensions and means different things as an attribute of the work, the scholar, and the audience. Some people divide interdisciplinarity into the following categories. Exploratory interdisciplinarity, that involves borrowing ideas and methods from other disciplines. Some people would describe this as multidisciplinarity. Then there is team-based interdisciplinarity, in which scholars from different disciplines collaborate to solve a problem or understand a phenomenon, a kind of cross-disciplinarity. Then there is paradigmatic interdisciplinarity that arises out of synthetic theories that operate across disciplines, such as Marxism, feminism, postmodernism, critical theory, constructivism, environmentalism in the social sciences and humanities, which is a form of transdisciplinarity. Then there is what some people call crossover interdisciplinarity, in which new fields are constituted from overlapping areas of several separate disciplines, such as anthropology, which, as we know, combines different areas: archaeology, physical anthropology, social anthropology, and so on. Social psychology and psycholinguistics, combining psychology and linguistics. And the vast new fields in STEM, in the biological sciences, for example, and those in information technology that have come in various very fascinating combinations: biotechnology, nanotechnology, data analytics, that will combine, of course, statistics and technology and so on and so forth, geoeconomics, and all those kinds of very exciting articulations of different fields. And then, of course, free-range interdisciplinarity. That refers to people with eclectic interests whose disciplinary homes are hard to fathom, a kind of pluridisciplinarity. In practice, and for many people, these categories are overlapping. The articulation of interdisciplinary activities, of course, also has a number of dimensions that are worth paying attention to. One is, of course, the social and institutional arrangements. And this, of course, you find that a lot of interdisciplinary programs are either independent programs, centers, or institutes, think tanks. There is the establishment of interdepartmental programs or committees, or interdisciplinary colleges, or faculty location in colleges instead of departments to broaden intellectual affiliation and dilute disciplinary loyalties. There is the interdisciplinarity in terms of problem-focused research projects, interinstitutional consortia and networks, and shared facilities and databases. Usually the battle for or against interdisciplinarity are about the visibility and legitimacy of multidisciplinary teaching and learning, and of cross-disciplinary research collaboration and communication. In producing interdisciplinary work, a scholar seeks to reach an audience both inside and outside one's discipline. But the practice of interdisciplinarity varies for a scholar performing as a writer and as a reader. As writers, we as scholars sometimes are inclined to interdisciplinarity by happily picking bits and pieces from other disciplines to enrich our work, framed by a disciplinary unconscious, despite protestations to the contrary. So when I do interdisciplinarity, my unconscious, to use that term as a historian, is always there. While as readers, they tend to be critical, even dismissive, of works that borrow from their disciplines, faulting them for misunderstandings and simplifications. Let me now share very briefly my personal journey with interdisciplinarity. As I said at the beginning, when you look at the dynamics of knowledge production, there are a number of things that one has to pay attention to. One is the historical geography. In other words, the location in time and space for scholars and academia, for universities. And the dynamics of knowledge production, and I've elaborated on this in a series of writings. I think they're typically what I call the 4 I's. One is intellectual, the prevailing paradigms, theories, you name it. And then 2 is ideological, the dominant ideologies of a particular period. And 3rd, institutional dynamics, the nature of institutions and how they change will affect, obviously, the nature of scholarship and knowledge being produced. And then finally, individual dynamics, social biography. All of us have a social biography defined by our gender, our race, nationality, class, religion, etc., which inform the ways in which we approach scholarship. Certainly, this is true in the social sciences and the humanities. But even in the sciences, this is true. If one takes, for example, the experience of women scientists in science, on which, of course, a lot has been written, and there have been struggles for inclusion of women in the natural sciences. My academic and social contexts are obviously critical in terms of my own self-reflection a kind of reflexivity as to why I joined or sort of trended towards interdisciplinarity. Let me begin sharing my own personal story by reading a short story written by a young writer when I was an undergraduate student in Malawi. And the story reads as follows. A biologist will see you as a creature of evolution, while a physiologist will see you as entirely a product of your organs, glands, diet, diseases, and their development. An anthropologist will see you only as a product of your culture, while a social psychologist may describe you as a victim of your social environment. And a psychologist thinks you're a slave of your subconscious drives. A linguist may believe you are completely molded by your language, and since language is the vehicle of thought and communication, while an artist or musician may see you as an aesthetic animal. A chemist may picture you as merely a quantity of atoms, whereas a physicist may explain you as primarily a complicated electrical mechanism. A philosopher will neglect your body and only see your mind, while a historian will see you as a product of the famines, earthquakes, revolts, and wars that occurred long before you were born, and even before your great-grandparents were born. An economist will see you as an asset to the continuous flow of money in society. The mathematician doesn't bother about you, not only because of your glaring inconsistencies and exasperating unpredictability, but also because he simply cannot add, subtract, multiply, or divide you. Your mother will always see you as a child, however big or great you may be, while a Christian sees you as a hopeless sinner needing salvation, and a fool will see you as a fool. That short story, the writer was myself. I wrote it when I was 19 in my first collection of short stories called Night of Darkness and other stories. It was published when I was 20. So in a sense, looking back, I believe that I have been convinced of the importance of interdisciplinarity for a very long time. And in terms of my academic and social context, the following, of course, is important. Educated in 3 countries, as Ben noted at the beginning, on 3 continents in different fields. Worked in a diversity of institutions in terms of size, research intensity, public and private, secular and religious affiliated, been engaged in disciplinary and interdisciplinary units in terms of my own appointment, and joint and transnational appointments. And my career has spanned post-colonial era in terms of Africa, the Cold War era, and of course the first 2 decades of the 21st century. My academic trajectories also, of course, have influenced my gravitation to interdisciplinarity out of my changing intellectual influences, ideological proclivities, institutional locations, and individual circumstances, including, of course, aging. And the key drivers when I look back is abiding curiosity and a deep sense of ignorance and voracious reading habits developed in my youth and passion for social justice and transformation. Let me conclude this by simply sharing with you some of my key intellectual preoccupations and maybe point to 1 or 2 of their sources. My first deep interest has always been in literature, creative writing. I've done 3 books of fiction, 2 collections of short stories and a novel. And the novel was written as a companion narrative to my PhD dissertation. As a history student, obviously, we have protocols in history in which archival data and all those things that matter in history were critical. But as I was writing the dissertation, it was very clear that as I was making arguments about what I was writing about, it was on economic history and labor, the people I was talking about had experiences that could not be captured in that text. And therefore, I was alternating between writing my dissertation and writing my novel. And essentially it's on the same issues, but one in a creative space, the other one in an academic context. And I found that mutually fulfilling because, of course, I could not make assertions in my dissertation without data, without evidence. But in the novel, I could, of course, imagine, based out of actually knowing and talking to people who were, working class and so on for the novel. So since then, I've done numerous essays on literary criticism, and this later morphed into cultural studies, including a co-edited volume on leisure in urban Africa, co-edited with my dear wife, who, as Toni Morrison, to paraphrase Toni Morrison, she's a friend of my mind. We are friends of each other's minds. And then, of course, economic history. And economic history, in my generation, we gravitated towards that because we were living at a time when we wanted to understand why Africa was poor, despite its enormous resources. And of course, at that time, there were a lot of theories and debates informed by Marxism, neoclassical studies, by dependency, and the development methodologies from Latin America to explain the different levels of development of society. And in that area, I've done 3 books, A Modern Economic History of Africa, Volume 1. What is interesting, the Volume 1 is on the 19th century. My dissertation was on the 20th century, focusing on Kenya. But I went to a school in Jamaica when I was teaching there. And a student asked me a question, which said, which was, how did Africans, how did they produce and consume and exchange, products before colonization? Now, my dissertation had been on colonial capitalism, and I couldn't really answer that student because I hadn't done pre-colonial African economic history, but that bothered me. And I spent the next 10 years trying to answer that student and, did research on pre-colonial African economic history, which ended up in this book, which some people regard as my most important book. Since it was published in the early 70s, I've been working on Volume 2, and being an administrator, I've not gone very far with it, but eventually it will come out. And then I did another book on Rethinking Africa's Globalization, Volume 1, also Volume 2 will come eventually. And then Africa's Resurgence, Domestic, Global, and Diaspora Transformations. And then all this led to my interest in development studies, and did a couple of books, Sacred Spaces and Public Quarrels, African Cultural and Economic Landscapes, Africa's Resurgence, Domestic, Global, and Diaspora Transformations, and then gender studies became very key for me. And part of the reason for that was coming from a society which in anthropological terms, you would call matrilineal. And then working in Kenya, doing my dissertation research, Kenya is mostly patrilineal. And people found it very strange that there were matrilineal societies, which again just underscores the diversities of African cultures. And this really, as well as with some of my earlier work, gravitated me to try to really look at gender studies, constructions of gender identities, and so on and so forth. And in fact, my first book was on women in the Kenyan economy and labor movement. And later on, a co-written book also with my dear partner, Women in African Studies Scholarly Publishing, how the different disciplines and the different journals publish men and women, and so on and so forth. And this, of course, gravitated towards intellectual history. And the intellectual history was really triggered when I was recruited to be director of the Center for African Studies at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I'd come from Canada. And the first conference I attended of the African Studies Association was a very heated conference because Philip Curtin, a very well-known Africanist historian, had written an op-ed in the Chronicle of Higher Education in 1995, which said, which was called the ghettoization of African history, by which he argued that African history was, the quality was declining because of the entry into the field of more African-American and African scholars. And this was so heated, I said to myself, wait a minute, what have I brought myself to? And I began to be interested in the development of African studies in the United States. And the first book in that area was a book called Manufacturing African Studies and Crisis. Then this gravitated to other areas of universities as knowledge-producing institutions. In other words, my intellectual history interest was in the areas of the history of ideas, how ideas emerge and change over time, and the history of knowledge-producing institutions. So I did 2 volumes of universities in the 21st century, edited. Then I used to teach a master's at the University of Illinois on the study of Africa in terms of all the disciplines in the social sciences and humanities, how they have constructed knowledges on Africa for the last 100 years, and how Africa has been studied in different geographical zones, in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, and of course in Africa itself. And this resulted in the 2-volume study, The Study of Africa, including essays, of course, from a series of contributors. And then the transformation of global higher education that I mentioned, and I was one of the associate editors of 6 volumes of the new Dictionary of the History of Ideas, which is about all the key ideas that have occurred among human beings, at least in historical times, and how they have developed. And then, having left my own country, of course, to study, but eventually getting involved in political activities to get rid of the dictatorship, I became very concerned about human rights. And some of the things we've been seeing in the United States recently resonate to some of the work some of us have been doing. So I entered this field and I've done 3 books: Human Rights, The Rule of Law, and Development in Africa, and then looked at conflicts. How do conflicts emerge? And what are the, not only the dynamics of conflicts, but of course the effects of those conflicts. So did a 2-volume study on the roots of African conflicts, and it's edited, and then the resolution of African conflicts. And when I was at the University of Illinois, again, as a director of the center, I was involved in organizing a lot of conferences. And I was always fascinated by doing conferences that bring different schools, different colleges in the university. And one year, we did a conference with a colleague of mine who was then the dean, he wasn't the dean yet, but he was the director of the nanotechnology lab at University of Illinois. Later on, he became the dean of the School of Engineering, and then the provost. And he and I convened a major conference on science and technology, in which we invited key figures in this area, including advisors to African governments on science and technology. And the book is entitled In Search of Modernity, Science and Technology in Africa. And then, given the fact that I'd left my own home country and came to the United States, first of all to Canada, and then the United States. And of course, when you are in exile, you think you're going back tomorrow. And of course, that doesn't happen. You end up, having a personal life. You get married sometimes. You have children sometimes. And in my case, of course, both of those happened. And, my wife is African-American. And my, daughter is born in North America. And she would bring friends to the house. And the friends would say, oh, we didn't know that your dad is from Africa. He speaks with a very cool accent, meaning, of course, strange. And with my wife and daughter, and as well as trying to understand myself as now a part of the new African diaspora, I wanted to understand my wife and my daughter in terms of where they're coming from. And this really was the trigger for my work in diaspora studies. And in 2005, when I was at Pennsylvania State University, I applied for a grant to the Ford Foundation. I got the money and spent the next 4 or 5 years traveling during summer to 16 countries in South America, the Caribbean, Europe, and Asia to talk to, interview, collect data on African diasporas. The project was to do 3 things. One, to look at them, to provide a mapping of the dispersal of African peoples over the last 2,000 years to other parts of the world. And secondly, to look at how those communities constructed their diasporic identities. And thirdly, how those communities imagined and engaged Africa. So I've done 2 books in that area, In Search of African Diasporas, Testimonies and Encounters, which is more or less a travelogue. Every day I was keeping a diary, and it's really a collection of my impressions, discussions, confusions, engagements in those 16 countries. And then the second one is called Barack Obama and African Diasporas, Dialogues and Dissensions. And out of this diaspora project came a project in which the Carnegie Corporation of New York asked me to do a project on how African academics in Canada and the United States engage African institutions. And eventually this became a program that Provost Vincent mentioned, and that is the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship Program, where we have sponsored more than 400 fellows, and we have just created what we are calling the Consortium of African Diaspora Scholars Programs to expand the program globally. So African descended peoples in the Americas, from the US to Brazil, in Europe, in Asia, and so on, and beyond academic engagements to other types of engagements. And we have registered it in New York as well as in Nairobi. Let me conclude by talking very briefly about academic enterprise after COVID, and I will not elaborate because of time. The pandemic has underscored the importance of interdisciplinary, integrated, inclusive perspectives and interventions. To understand the spread, impact, and mitigation of the pandemic requires the work of epidemiologists and other health specialists, social scientists, and humanists. The development and implementation of the various COVID-19 vaccines will also entail multidisciplinary, multinational, multi-sectoral, multicultural, and multi-generational initiatives and interventions. For example, in the United States, there is a debate about how some communities, including African Americans, have certain misgivings about vaccines because of a particular history. And if you want to therefore intervene effectively, you have to understand the history. You have to understand the sociology. You even have to understand the ways in which you discuss those issues. In other words, the discourse you use, the language you use, the communication strategies that you develop. The pandemic has posed enormous challenges and accelerated profound changes in higher education, requiring reprioritization and changes in the operations that affect core functions of universities and organizational culture and governance, in which broadly interdisciplinary perspectives and approaches become imperative. What are some of these changes? There are 7 critical ones, and again, I will not elaborate. One is reduced resources, declining government support, student tuition pressures, increased competition for research grants and philanthropic donations. 2, growing competition, increasing number of tertiary institutions, public, private, and for profit. The number of universities across the world, for example, has increased multiple fold. By 2018, there were 18,772 universities. For Africa, there were 1,682, having increased from 784 in 1999. And there is increased diversity of providers of higher education and the rising importance of global and regional rankings. Thirdly, the impact of the 4th industrial revolution, which is leading to the decline of some traditional academic fields and the rise of new ones, facilitating changes and improvements in institutional, business, operations, and processes, the development of new modalities of teaching and learning, and forcing more attention to be paid to innovation and entrepreneurship. And then 4th, of course, is the changing nature of jobs, need for continuous reskilling, upskilling, and lifelong learning. A report by the World Economic Forum that came out in October, the Future of Jobs Report 2020, points out that the 10 critical skills for jobs of the future include analytical thinking and innovation, active learning and learning strategies, complex problem solving, critical thinking and analysis, creativity, originality and initiative, leadership and social influence, technology use, monitoring and control, technology design and programming, resilience, stress tolerance, and flexibility. And they point out that a lot of the growing areas are in STEM, health sciences, and the creative arts. And the importance, therefore, of hard and soft skills, content knowledges, and liberal arts literacies cannot be overemphasized. There is also shifts in university demographics, generational shifts in university constituencies. Universities, of course, today include people from baby boomer generation, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and very soon we're going to have Gen Alpha, each one of them with their own ways of learning and so on. And therefore growing pressures for diversity and inclusion, need for lifelong learning, and of course for us to focus on adult students. And of course internationalization in both physical and virtual forms. And growing public demands on universities, questions about the value proposition of universities, contributions to the public good and national development, expectations for collaboration and external partners, including private-public partnerships. And finally, the impact of COVID-19. We all know about it, and how it is accelerating the digitalization of teaching and learning, operational processes, and service delivery at universities. And of course, there are dangers of cybersecurity and what some people call surveillance capitalism. All these obviously mean that we have to undertake a lot of changes in terms of how we think of our institutional structures, how we think of our academic programs, how we deliver teaching and learning, how we mobilize human resources in terms of recruiting for talent, retooling and retention of faculty and staff, resource mobilization and utilization beyond some of the traditional ones, institutional partnerships, and of course, sharpening skills of university leaders at all levels. And obviously, this means how do we develop ways and means of providing that sharpening of skills process. In conclusion, my current work is, of course, participating as a presenter or facilitator in a series of national, continental, and global conversations through webinars on how universities are managing COVID-19, and there are a number of organizations locally and internationally, some of which I'm on their boards, in which I've been participating, and writing research papers and short essays, for example, for University World News and other outlets on some of these key changes and developments that are taking place because of COVID-19. And if you allow me, the Provost and the Dean, for me just to share with you, finally, just one little advertisement that I'm sure you wouldn't mind me doing that, and that is the closure of my presentation. Okay. Well, I was trying to share a copy of my book. Somehow it's not coming out. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Zeleza. That was a very impactful, interesting, and amazing, insightful talk. I want to just begin by thanking you for your major achievements that have really had an impact on the world. It's very difficult for us to really do things in our careers that really make a difference at the level that you have. And so I want to first thank you for that. I want to discuss appreciation for hearing more about how you got into diaspora studies and your work there, and to re-mention the impacts of interdisciplinary that you talk about and really how extensive that is, ranging from our scholarship, from discovery, from social justice and human rights, spanning all the way to education in our very lives in the university, and how impactful interdisciplinary work is. So I want to thank you for those comments in that area, and just to express how wonderful it is to have gotten to know you better through this seminar, and thank you for that. We have a number of questions that have come in on the chat, and I would like to move into those now. We have until 15 past the hour to engage in this conversation with you. The first question comes from Peter Whitehouse, and I'll go ahead and read that. What do you think the rise of transdisciplinarity is telling us about academia? Do we need to be more active in changing and challenging neoliberal influences on universities as we challenge modern values and thinking and birth new forms of civilization that are more friendly towards nature?
My answer would be, if I was to use one word, yes. We need to challenge these neoliberal agendas. And of course, myself being an administrator, I'm only too aware of those agendas in terms of corporatization of universities, commercialization of knowledge, and so on and so forth. I think we need to make sure that, first of all, understand why they came about. And secondly, what kind of strategies we need to develop in order to challenge them in ways that has integrity, has rigor, because we're academics, and also has transformative value. In the final analysis, I think our work has to be guided by very profound ethical principles to change the world for the better, to leave the world better than we found it. And one of the biggest challenges that the world currently faces is climate change. And universities have to produce knowledges that enlighten us as to those dangers, influence policymakers, and raise consciousness and awareness among young people and others, and the kinds of activities that will be useful to mitigate against these dangers, because the threat of climate change, for example, is the very disappearance of human civilization.
Thank you. I appreciate that, especially having spent really 30 years in climate change research. I acknowledge how critical that issue is, and that in academia is where we are likely to find the solutions for that challenge. So thank you for that insight. The next question comes from Mark Joseph. How do you define academic capital? And do you think our mindset about academic capital needs to change? How can we make those changes if so?
Yeah, that's, again, a wonderful, wonderful question. Academic capital, of course, has like any form of capital, has various dimensions, and particularly in this context. One is, of course, their material aspects, and then their symbolic aspects, and then their cultural aspects, and so on. So one, we have to unpack academic capital. It's about resources, the mobilization, utilization, distribution, sharing of resources. But it's also in terms of symbolic aspects, which fields, which areas of research have prestige in the academy. And again, we need to bring in our lens as academics to understand our own institutions, how we operate. We are very good as academics understanding other sectors, other ways of doing things, but not looking at ourselves. So once we begin to interrogate the different forms of academic capital and how they're used either to suppress, marginalize certain voices and empower others at the expense of some people, then we again need to be able to develop mechanisms of trying to transcend that. And part of that mechanism is in fact developing interdisciplinary perspectives that eschew this kind of ethnocentric way of saying, my field is the best. Let's get all the resources. And at the same time, so building alliances. So first of all, understand what the issues are and build alliances in order to overcome some of these iniquitous divisions and dangerous aspects of the ways in which our institutions are organized that in fact reinforce inequalities, which are not necessarily useful for building knowledges that are transformative.
Thank you for that. And the next question from Jay Galler really leads into the next part of that to get your views on this. As we rethink the university in light of increasing interdisciplinarity or the presumed need for interdisciplinarity? How should universities or colleges be structured? What should happen with traditional based departments or new organizational structures? A very tough question.
That's a $64 million question, which I'm sure you as the dean and Provost Vinson has been grappling with.
We think every day about it.
I think the key point is, of course, you know, the way universities are organized, and the structure has never remained the same. So that's one thing I think to bear in mind. There have been changes, and in my book I sort of look at all these changes over the last 70 years. I think it's to be flexible. It's easier said than done, because all of us also get invested in what we do. So, you know, building flexibility. And one of the things I think COVID-19 has shown us is that it's extremely important for flexibility to be at the center of how we do business. So, for example, if you are going to look at flexibility in terms of, you know, the leadership skills, which I mentioned earlier, you know, we all have to develop a certain technological deftness. It's not enough for us to, you know, sort of claim to use technologies, but we have to exhibit and model and promote institutional technological savviness. And COVID-19 demonstrated that. Crisis management, we have to do it in ways that is not just the old crisis we are used to dealing with in terms of security threats, natural crisis, but this one has also forced us to rethink. How do we, for example, think about the ways in which cultural competence is understood? You know, a lot of universities, including we, the leaders, are very good at making all sorts of diversity and inclusion statements, when in fact, you know, what we do in our institutions does not really address systemic injustice, inequality, and privilege, and so on. There is a very good article in yesterday's The Chronicle of Higher Education, how universities are responsible for creating the kind of chaos and mayhem that we saw on Capitol Hill. So flexibility, adaptability, resilience, and of course, being able to shift with times. Now, as I said, that's easier said than done.
Thank you. The next question comes from Emmett Jolly. He was curious about the comment about small departments and their value with respect to interdisciplinarity. Yeah. Should important small departments remain open to maintain distinctions or be merged into larger departments? And would this enhance interdisciplinarity or really hinder it? How do we manage this in response to the financial strains that many universities have?
Again, that's an excellent question, which again, all of us as administrators grapple with. For me, one of the key things, you know, when people talk about small departments, sometimes they talk about them as being small in terms of enrollment, in terms of, it's really enrollment, in terms of finances and so on and so forth. The danger of measuring, you know, size in terms of enrollments is that sometimes you lose the value of what those bring. So, for example, when I was dean at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, we had, you know, classics was one department. It had very small enrollments. And some people were pushing, oh no, why can't we combine it with this and that and so on. And my thing is, you have to look at what is the intellectual value it's bringing. And it's bringing a lot of intellectual value in terms of how, you know, what I call the 4 eyes of the liberal arts: intercultural understanding, international understanding, intellectual understanding, and of course that interdisciplinary understanding, that without those departments, without those areas of focus, you're going to lose. So it's a very fine balancing act. And at the same time, how does every discipline, and one of the challenges, frankly, I posed to classics department was, okay, classics is very important, but to what extent are you inclusive? When you talk of classics, to what extent are you including classics from other civilizations. And when it comes to classics between, say, the European classics based on Rome and Greece and so on and so forth, those parts were in constant conversations with Africa. To what extent is Africa fitting into that? So expand your scope so that you can continue doing those wonderful things, but understand you're in a different world. Because the students you're having are coming from Asia, they're coming from Europe, they're coming from, of course, Africa, and they're coming from different backgrounds. So the departments must continually, in my view, re-examine what they do so that they maintain the integrity of what they've always done, but in a new context, in an expanded generative space.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Very insightful point. From Tyler Remshizel, thank you for a most excellent presentation. You mentioned a few skills that are essential for interdisciplinary work, including curiosity, complex problem solving, and innovation. What other key skills should you focus on if we want to teach students how to do interdisciplinary work well? And I'd like to add one more point there, and that is you mentioned in such an interesting way how when you're becoming interdisciplinary, you really are, in a sense, learning a second language. So how not only do we train our students to be able to be more interdisciplinary, but how do we as scholars open up that process of learning that new language and being able to engage with each other at that level?
I think for the scholars, we need to have the same attitude that the person asking the question identified, namely curiosity, having that boundless curiosity. And also, I think what is critical is humility. To understand that what you know is not the sum total of human knowledge. I'll just give you one example. When I was doing my research on the diaspora, I went to Oman in the Gulf, and I met an African-American artist who was 94 years old. And he had on his bedside 2 books on one side and 2 books on another. And he said something to me, which I've never forgotten. He said, I told him, I said, you read a lot. And he said, yes, I do. And he said, I do that because I want to know today what I did not know yesterday. And I said, goodness, this guy is 94 years old. That boundless curiosity. And a lot of us as academics, when we are teaching, we need to have the humility of showing we don't know, that we co-learn with the students. So it's our own pedagogical styles. But at the same time, I think another value that is important is one of resilience. Knowing another field, knowing something that you didn't know, leads you to a lot of failure. It humbles you. And of course, you fall down several times. But you need to be able to say to yourself, yes, I have, it's like learning language. There is a myth that young people, their brains are able to process language better than older people. That may be true. In fact, yesterday I was reading an essay on that very topic. And what it said is that young people have more time. That's all. We don't have enough time, and we're very impatient. So we need patience. We need humility. We need curiosity. We need flexibility. We need resilience.
Thank you. Thank you. Really important words to think about as we continue on our road, many of us, on trying to become more interdisciplinary and enhance our scholarship in that ways to really, truly help to solve societal and global challenges. I just wanted to end with one additional question. I'm just so impressed by all that you've done and the contributions that you have made ever since you were 19 with that amazing article, helping us to see how we see ourselves in a disciplinary way and how we could greatly expand that if we were to be more open-minded and have this humility that you mentioned. And once you're done being a university president, which I know must be a daunting, challenging job with all the other work that you do, what do you most look forward to doing in the days after that?
Wow, that's yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Frankly, I want to go back to what my first love. The reason why I became and I joined the academy, and that is teaching and learning, research and scholarship. So I teach once a year in my current position. So I'm teaching this semester. And my executive assistant tells me that the day she sees me most excited is when I'm teaching. So, just to undergraduate students especially, of course, graduate students bring a different dimension to you. And just to see the light go up in their eyes. And then also they ask you the kinds of questions that, force you to go back to foundational issues, like the question I mentioned from my high school student in Jamaica, which, set me for 10 years. In fact, now it will be 40 years of my research, So go back to teaching and learning, and then research and scholarship. I've got so many projects I want to work on. And then secondly, mentoring junior colleagues or younger colleagues in terms of academic career, as well as, of course, those who might be interested in administrative leadership. I was fortunate that I had very good mentors, and to use that overwrought word, I would like to give back, to pass the baton to people behind us, and use my experience, and frankly to provide advisory services to institutions that are grappling with all sorts of issues about changes which have been accelerated by COVID-19. So a part of me, of course, thoroughly and fully enjoy. Maybe enjoy is too strong a word, but I'm fascinated by being an administrator, because it has contributed to my scholarship in very profound ways. And of course, like yourself and the provost and your president, I'm sure COVID-19 has made you extraordinarily busy in trying to deal with these challenges. It is, the challenges have been very powerful and of course, very invigorating, thinking about navigating the challenges, but also how do you begin thinking about the future post-COVID. That's been exciting, but after that, I just want to do my research and mentor colleagues and really teach.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Dr. Zeleza, our audience, we are unfortunately running at that allotted hour. I want to thank everyone for coming out. We had such a robust participation. Thank you so much for coming out for our first of these North Star seminar series. I also want to just say how much this presentation has illuminated our pathways and our North Star. It's actually somewhat of a mesmerizing, mind-blowing experience, the journey that you've been through, the areas that you've been able to touch, the areas that you've been able to contribute to, and how you've been able to see it all holistically, not just from an academic and an intellectual perspective, but also then working within the system, in these systems of higher education, within foundations, connecting that with students, and then still having the time to think about this in a different frame, in a literary frame. I think it's a very, very illuminating to all of us. And we want to thank you for this as we muddle through our own difficult times here in the United States, as we begin to process what interdisciplinarity means for us as a community and how we can begin to unleash its power in our own domains, but also with the greater objective of transforming our society and our world. Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. Zeleza. It has been a true pleasure.
Thank you. It was my honor, and wishing everybody a great 2021. Thank you.